How's good? Can you hear it on the speakers too? Okay. Where'd you get that lay? That's cool.
I don't remember. Gumi made it for me at some point.
So I'm gonna do the D and things that I talk a lot anyway. But I'd like to introduce Jeff's family to you guys in case for those that haven't met. His mom and his dad and brother are in from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, visiting. So I'll
Welcome.
let Jeff introduce. Sorry to steal your thunder.
Yes, my mom Sharon. Hello. My dad Bernie. Hello. And my brother Matt.
Welcome.
My name's
That's Ken.
Yeah, that's Ken. He's our Ken. He's our unique Ken. My name's Justin. I'm not a teacher. I'm a discussion leader, so that lets me get away with more things than I usually can. All right. Someone want to open us up in prayer this morning? Justin?
Dear Father, thank you for gathering us here today on this fine, wonderful Sunday. Lord, could it be any better? Even if it wasn't good, we should always look at the positive. But anyways, please help us to take with the Sunday school teacher said still with, and wait, we'll saying there is his mouth and put it right into our hearts and allow it to help us be the best people that we can be out there on the road as showing showing you showing you and who you are through our good works and our actions and our attitude, trying to be the best that we can be for us. And with that being said, in his name, amen.
Amen. All right. So we've been looking at the wisdom of Christ. We talked about, the many names that Christ has, brother, friend, Savior. And one of the names that used to be common with Christ was philosopher. So we've been looking at the wisdom of Christ. And we've been in Matthew 5. So Jesus ducks away with his disciples and begins teaching on essentially what it means to lead a good life in relation to God. So, these are what are commonly referred to as the Beatitudes. So we've been looking at each one of these, and we ended last weekend with in verse 11. So how blessed you are when people insult you and persecute you and tell all kinds of vicious lies about you because you follow me. Rejoice, be glad, because your reward in heaven is great. They persecuted the prophets before you in the same way. So we kind of discussed, some of the ways that, we have made, if you've been persecuted for your walk, and kind of discussed, how easy we have it here, obviously, and that potentially can make us lazy in our faith, to always be willing to accept persecution, and kind of discussed any situations that we've been in where we would consider it not necessarily persecution, but being looked down on or called ignorant because of our faith. So it was a good discussion. And then we got into should have started in the slide. So we read Isaiah 42 and discussed what the following verses says. You are the salt for the land, but if that salt becomes tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except being thrown out for people to trample on. So we took this analogy of salt and discussed how, as small as our church community here is, how big an impact we can have on the Posable community if we're actively being good disciples, sharing the gospel. And also started getting into another aspect of salt, which is what? For one, it's a seasoning, right? And it also acts as a preservative. So how can we apply that to this analogy? Well, as we read in Isaiah 42, Christ brings about justice through truth. So, likewise, when we agree to enter into a covenant with Christ, with God, and start walking that life, we become the marshals and stewards of truth as well. What do we mean when we say truth?
Know the truth and be honest.
Okay, so that's a characteristic.
Yeah.
To be an arbiter of truth.
To be a steward of truth and an arbiter of truth are two different things. Stewardship is preservation. An arbiter is judgment or decision making with it. You can do both at the same time, but they aren't the same thing.
Right.
I think historically people have preferred to be arbiters because there's more power in that versus stewards. Christ's message, what is
When like Isaiah 42, when it talks about being a steward or arbiter of truth, what does truth encompass?
The message that we're given in God's word from the world. So be the one that stands in that gap and
Okay.
shows the world by both the written word and our lives what God has expects of us and what His word promises us, but to share it.
Okay.
Yeah, I kind of associate truth with faith, and maybe they're different words, clearly, but there's different types of faiths, and yeah, maybe that's what you're trying to draw out is the true faith, like God is good and God is the truth.
Yeah.
Kind of grasping at something.
Yeah, it's not an easy question to ask or answer, but we'll look at aspects of this when we talk about Yeshua as fulfilling the Torah. So yeah, when we use the analogy of salt, we're called to preserve truth. especially in our community. Because that ties in with the next verse. It says in verse 14, "You are the light for the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Likewise, when people light a lamp, they don't cover it with a bowl, but put it on a lampstand so that it shines for everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people so that they may see the good things you do and praise your Father in heaven." So what is the function of light? Oftentimes it's associated with knowledge, to reveal, right, or cast away darkness or shadow.
Also as a beacon, like even if you don't know what it is, it's attention grabbing.
Mm-hmm.
Folks will gravitate towards it if they have a need to see more before they even know what it is.
Right. So we're called to be the light of our community, our town. Whenever I read this verse, I'm reminded of a column I read years ago. It was an older black gal. I can't remember her name. I wish I would have saved the column, but she talks about, she lived through the Jim Crow era, during that whole segregation and persecution. And she talks about how the people she expected to come to her aid, especially the white, because back then, well, even today, the churches were pretty segregated, and none of the white churches stood up for them. They sat back, yeah, and were quiet. And even against the other, there were a lot of white church folks that were the ones doing the persecution, doing the segregation. So in the name of Christ. So they didn't, she goes into describing how they didn't even stick up against those people. So, when I think about being the light, that was not being the light. So now I think about, are there scenarios in our day and age where we're sitting back and not acting on injustice? And how far do you take that? Do you become activists? How far do you take that in your life? How involved do you get in your community? How involved do you get in your government? Something to think about. I was in an interesting discussion during my last trip in California. One of the engineers, we went out to dinner, me and a few of the engineers, and one of the fellas was talking about how they're transitioning their son, 15-year-old son. He's taken GnRH, which if you're not familiar with, is a puberty blocker. So basically, he's castrating his son, and he said it was in support of his wife, primarily. It was her decision, and he was just there supporting it. And I didn't really have well, at the time I'm like, well, man, I don't know these, I email them and talk with them on the phone, but I don't know these gentlemen. So I was kind of just keeping quiet, just listening to their discussion. And one of the other engineers, was describing how, especially in around where they live, which is just outside of Los Angeles, a lot of women, and I'm not, this is just him saying this, I'm not dissing on women by all means, but said that a lot of mothers, it's almost like a clique, like it's a badge of morality for them to have their children. It's a bragging point. My son is transitioning. He's taking GnRH, and you know, I thought about it like, you know, as a you have a child who doesn't have, I mean, they trust their parents, they're confused, and their parents are leading down a path that is irreversible. And so I mean, what can I do in that situation, you know, with my coworkers? I mean, I should be a arbiter of truth, which, you know, that's dealing with one of the most fundamental aspects of what God created, male and female, being, you know, corrupted by parents, ultimately. So, I don't know, just some things to think about, you know, in your own life, in your own situations. When should we speak up? When should we be quiet? When should we seek peace? You know, seeking peace is one of the things that, you know, to lead a good life says we'll be blessed with if we seek peace. But, you know, it takes wisdom to know when speaking up would do more damage than good. So, yeah, just something to think about. Any situations in your life where, you know, you felt like as a light bearer you should have probably spoke up or did speak up, or
Comes up in my work.
yeah,
As I'm writing strategic plans for stewarding funds to promote community-wide mental health improvement. I mean, if you're looking at numbers, explicit numbers, kids who identify as something other than what they're born tend to have higher rates of substance use behaviors. It's just, it's not that all kids that are like that do drugs, but that there is a correlation there for sure. So writing intervention strategies to support and promote the mental health of that demographic, it's my job to not to create those programs, but write in that there is a need for those programs and whatever they look like. And it's kind of neutral, but it's also not neutral. So it's like, is this a field that I need to leave? Because at the end of the day, my name's on that strategic plan. I'm the crafter of it. Crafted it using the guidelines from the stakeholder group that said we want to see X, Y, and Z done. So I take this, it's like, am I a neutral piece? Because I'm not the one deciding it.
Who are the stakeholders, out of curiosity?
We've got a large group of community members comprised of law enforcement, youth serving organizations, school teachers, healthcare providers. There's like 12 different sectors I have cultivated from that reflect the needs and the wants of the community. And I don't write anything from my own
And
perspective.
the community religious organizations?
I've had zero luck recruiting religious organizations,
Really?
but they are an identified stakeholder. The only one that will call me back is the local Methodist church. That is an affirming group, so they would be
It's not
in
kids at Jefferson, right? You're Jefferson.
So it's a gray area for me.
Yeah.
Because I'm not, again, it's like I'm justifying it to myself as I'm not the one writing this, but at the same time I am the one writing it.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of anxiety, depression, there's a lot of stuff that's out there.
So much.
Yeah.
And I think what Holly does is very helpful in many cases because they need resources to sort those things out.
Definitely.
But when you're looking for advice, especially as a child, and you go around and you get advice and you don't like the advice, you go to the next person to affirm and justify that I am feeling this way, and you look for, everybody does this. Everybody does this, you know, kids and adults, right? You gather on a group of people, and when you're looking for validation and affirmation, you tend to seek out the people that, you know, in an immature sense, you'll look for the people that'll be like, yeah, you should be upset about that, you know, how dare they? In my maturity, I've realize that that's not always the best thing, and so I'll be like, I need you to tell me, like, there's people I found that will be straight with me and not worry about hurting my feelings and communicate what I believe to be honest truth. You're 100. Thank you so much. But that's not the societal norm. Is if you find yourself, if you perceive yourself as an outsider, then you go to find your fringe group, and then you kind of sit and you stew in it, and then
Where I get caught up is, I mean, we're called to be loving to everybody. And, you know, even if they are so set in their ways, I mean, we are called to love them. And maybe loving them is just finding the resources for them to explore those things. And
maybe
I mean, everybody's path is just a little different.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe they change their mind later,
some things you can change your mind.
but sometimes you can't reverse what it's done.
You can't buy a pack of cigarettes till you're 21. There's a lot of things you shouldn't do before you're 21.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did the state law change when the administration changed the federal law,
About parental consent.
parental consent,
I believe that did last year. I believe that
Okay.
was,
last year?
I believe last legislative session, it
Okay.
became a law of continuing, affirming care without parental consent over age
Yeah.
15, I think. They wanted it
I think it was 13.
I think they asked for 13.
Oh.
I believe it was amended to 15. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. I thought it changed.
Because that doesn't fall under substance use, I don't follow it I probably should follow it more, but
Yep.
there's so much I
So
can't follow
much
at the bill.
trying to follow right now, so
Yeah.
I feel bad about it.
There's a lot going on.
But yeah, I mean, that's good. You bring up a lot. You bring up some of the hardest things to being a light bearer, right? I mean, one, it takes confidence as one of them, confidence in believing that God will, support you, whether it's having the right words to say, like in that discussion with those guys, I don't know if I had confidence because I don't have experience in that, for one.
Being labeled a bigot is a career ender.
Yeah.
If something happens and I step out of line, my career is over.
Yeah.
And I need to be okay with that, but the innermost parts of me is very worried about that.
Right.
It's probably inevitable that you're going to have a moral dilemma at some point. I mean, in reality, right? Based on what you do. I understand.
I mean, everybody's got to make their own choices. I think the important thing is to give them options. You can show them, hey, well, there's this, but there's also.
And you bring up another, you bring up another good point of, one of the things that that is hard as being, kind of an arbiter of truth is the attitude and perspective, right? It's easy to just take a hard line and say, no, that's wrong. It's even harder, I think, to spend time to understand their perspective and what they're dealing with and why they got to that point, which is, I think, the right approach.
But she's not making policy for
Right.
one person.
Right.
Which I've got 2 points, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So the first one goes right along with that is in the current chaos, I call it chaos 2020, it's causing people to think about, oh my gosh, what are we going to do without these programs? Whatever programs are being cut today, that might be different from last week. our society has changed dramatically in the last 100 years. It used to be that people would go to the churches for help. People would go to the churches, you know, when you do that, I cannot see all the people over there.
I'm trying to hear you.
I know you are, I know, but I'm just telling you, when you do that, it's very disconcerting for me.
Sorry, I apologize.
So, that's changed because the government has stepped into the role that for a long time was filled by the churches, being the place where people would go to seek help, not just financial help, because that's the only kind of request we get right now. We don't get requests for spiritual advice. We don't get requests for, I'm in this moral dilemma, you know, what do I do? That kind of thing. I mean, I do from inside the church, but not from outside. It's usually, I need a place to stay. Can you buy me a hotel room? Well, no, we don't give out money. Can we arrange for a place to stay? Never mind, I'll call somebody else. Click, you know, that kind of thing. So the government has taken up a big part of what that light was supposed to be, because Jesus has modeled going around doing good in order to show people who he was, in order to show what God was all about. A lot of that has been taken by government programs, which would be one-on-one, because it would be somebody interfacing with somebody from the church. You know, you've got a friend that needs help, you come to the church, say, my friend needs help, we discuss it, we reach out, we help them, we provide, you know, we minister to them the way that we're supposed to. That's one of the things we're supposed to be doing that has been curtailed. So I say social programs go away, yay, more opportunity for us. Now we're just, our impact's in Paulsbo, but if all the churches have that ability, what kind of difference will that make? Because it won't only be a programmed response like you're writing, which is good. I agree. You know, I agree. You're doing good. It'll be a tailored response, one-on-one or church to person or small group to person. It's going to be more in line with meeting the person's needs, both physically, mentally, and spiritually. Now, the only difference is, I think, you know, not everybody is equipped to do that. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't, you know, it might be beyond my level of experience, which I would refer them to somebody else that had more experience, and maybe negotiate and exchange, negotiate and facilitate that, right? That's something that we would do. But so that's the first thing, which is interesting in the way the whole our culture has changed since World War II ended. And now we're right at the precipice of that changing again, our cultural viewpoint, which is a very good study, which I want to talk to you about. I said that so we can remind you can remind me to talk about it, because I'll forget. But secondly, you asked for experience examples.
Yeah.
COVID, week 4, I was here and opened the church back up. And I got to tell you, I mean, the way that Washington was playing the game, there seemed to be a high probability of somebody getting upset and somebody walking in and arresting me.
Well, that happened in Michigan, right?
It did, and it did not happen in Washington, but we were, you know, on the leading edge of that, and it came down to what the scripture says about what the assembly is and what the assembly needs, and balanced against the facts that I had at the time, which were more accurate than the media facts that were going on at the time. But none of that mattered, because they had made it a law that you couldn't meet, you know, more than X number of people, blah 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 blah. Just no meeting, period. That's before they loosened it up. And I mean, that was a real decision.
Yeah.
And it's on me as the leader to lead this group and to whatever we're going to do. At least throw it out there and make a rational argument. I don't make the ultimate decision, but but I would have been the only one that was culpable because I'm the only employee, and the government only has cognizance over the employees of a nonprofit to hold them accountable. So it wouldn't have been anybody else that showed up here. It would have been the employee.
Right.
So that was interesting. That was an interesting exercise.
Yeah.
I've been in that situation one other time, and I'm not going to go into all the history, but I'll do that later.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, yeah, that's good. When did you want to talk about the cultural aspect?
Later with you.
Oh, okay. See, even though it's important to remember, being the salt of the earth, being a arbiter of truth, and being the light, in more, most likely you'll find yourself in a uncomfortable or difficult position if you carry that position out, right? And I'm reminded of, what David went through, because David was an arbiter of truth. Under David's rule, Israel experienced the apex, the most successful that the nation had been, right, in history under David, following Solomon. And the scenarios that David went through, the persecution, being sought out by the prior king, and just his attitude about it just reminded me of Psalm 18. I'll read it really quick. Psalm 18, verse 16, it says, "He sent from on high, he took me and pulled me out of deep water. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from those who hated me, for they were stronger than I. They came against me on my day of disaster, but Adonai was my support. He brought me out to an open place. He rescued me because he took pleasure in me. Adonai rewarded me for my uprightness. He repaid me because my hands were clean. For I have kept the ways of Adonai. I have not done evil by leaving my God, for all his rulings were before me. I did not distance his regulations from me. I was pure-hearted with him and kept myself from my sin," which is an interesting phrase as well to look at. Kept myself from my sin. So, it's just important to remember, and I'm guilty of this, and I think I talked about this last week, and just being in a situation where, again, with work, where my boss and some of the other guys were basically, they were advocating for, evolution and bad-mouthing creationists, and I just sat there and kept my mouth shut, but, because I think back, was it just because I didn't want to put myself in a uncomfortable situation? Was it because I didn't have enough confidence to stick up for myself or for God, which God doesn't need me to stick up for him, but, or was it just because nothing would have came out of it? It would have just been an argument that with no fruits. So, but it's important to remember, you shouldn't shy away from a situation because you're afraid of being thought of as stupid or ignorant, because as David says, as long as you're doing God's will and practicing or living righteously, he will reward us. So I'll stop there. It's 11 o'clock. I wanted to get to the next verse, but we'll do that next weekend, where Yeshua Christ says he is the fulfillment of the Torah. So we'll look at what